Have you ever experienced an unexplainable sense of unease when encountering certain individuals? As though something hidden yet profoundly disturbing lurked behind their pleasant demeanor. Carl Jung, among psychology's most insightful minds, uncovered a troubling behavioral pattern throughout his extensive clinical practice. There exists a subtle indication that exposes a threat more perilous than any overt physical aggression. This warning sign, often overlooked by our rational mind yet recognized by our deepest survival instincts, doesn't reveal itself through hostile language or obviously toxic conduct. It remains elusive and precisely due to this quality, becomes infinitely more hazardous. Ancient teachings long cautioned against such individuals. Yet Jung succeeded in providing scientific articulation to what our forebears intuitively understood. The most concerning aspect: this warning can emerge in people who seem entirely ordinary, even magnetic in their appeal. When you recognize it, the only rational course of action is immediate retreat. But before we continue, please like this video, share it with people who might find it valuable, and write in the comments which city you're following our YouTube channel from. Shadow displacement represents arguably the most treacherous psychological process Jung identified within human interactions. Picture this scenario. You're engaged in dialogue with someone who abruptly assigns to you motives, beliefs, or harmful characteristics you've never exhibited or demonstrated. This individual isn't responding to your actual self, but to a warped interpretation they've constructed mentally. Does this resonate with your experience? What you're witnessing in that instant is Jungian shadow displacement in its most undiluted manifestation. The shadow embodies everything we disown about our nature. Elements we deem intolerable that we banish to our unconscious realm. Nevertheless, these components don't vanish. They merely exist beyond our aware perception, gathering force within our psychological depths. When someone habitually displaces their shadow onto others, they're displaying the most hazardous indicator Jung recognized: complete incapacity to acknowledge their own rejected qualities. This person literally cannot perceive these traits within themselves. Therefore, they observe them solely in other people. The peril exists in how, from their viewpoint, you genuinely embody those destructive characteristics. Ancient spiritual systems grasped this dynamic millennia before Jung expressed it academically. Buddhism discusses the tainted mirror that reflects personal impurities as external phenomena. Christian doctrine presents the metaphor of the log in one's vision while identifying the splinter in another's sight. What proves truly disturbing is that the shadow-projecting individual remains utterly convinced of their perceptual accuracy. They aren't deliberately deceiving. They genuinely observe in you what they refuse to accept in themselves. This distorted perception creates a specific type of certainty that proves remarkably convincing to observers. The projecting person can persuade others that you match their exact description. Modern neuroscience has validated Jung's theories. Our minds literally screen reality to support our established convictions. However, in instances of extensive shadow displacement, this screening becomes complete reality distortion. Scholar Robert Johnson likened this occurrence to wearing lenses that alter everything perceived. But how do you identify when confronting someone who massively projects their shadow? The telltale indicator emerges when you notice disconnection between their statements about you and your inner reality. They blame you for intentions you've never possessed or assign emotions you haven't felt. Most unsettling, they do this with complete confidence, resistant to contradictory proof. What truly occurs during such encounters? You're witnessing the external expression of internal conflict. This person desperately battles self-aspects they cannot embrace, and you've inadvertently become their battleground. Hell's path is constructed with good intentions, states the old saying. Jung might add, and navigated by those who consider themselves unquestionably righteous. Ego expansion constitutes extraordinary danger precisely because it masquerades as righteousness. When observing someone utterly convinced of their moral supremacy, spiritual infallibility, or absolute truth possession, you're seeing what Jung termed psychological inflation, perhaps the most alarming sign of all. Unlike simple arrogance, which remains easily identifiable, Jungian inflation represents a deeper, more dangerous phenomenon. It occurs when someone's ego merges with archetypal content, particularly savior, enlightened being, or truth-bearer imagery. This person no longer views themselves as limited humans, but as divine or absolute representatives. German mystic Meister Eckhart centuries ago warned about this occurrence, describing it as spirituality's most subtle snare. Zen traditions label it Zen disease, while Sufis reference the luminous veil, more dangerous than darkness's veil because it's much harder to recognize as obstruction. The unmistakable indicator appears when noticing this person never questions their own motivations. While history's greatest sages expressed profound humility before existence's mysteries, those suffering psychological inflation display absolute certainty. They don't consider error possibilities because mentally they're not expressing personal views but universal truths. Particularly dangerous about this condition is its potential for extraordinary charisma. Jung observed how leaders with severe psychological inflation attracted devoted followers precisely due to their radiated absolute conviction. This certainty satisfies our deep human need for security and definitive responses in an uncertain world. Chilean psychologist Claudio Naranjo, a spiritual tradition student, noted that spiritual ego proves most refined and difficult to detect. Ordinary ego declares, "I am significant." Inflated ego proclaims, "I am supreme goodness's channel." This subtle distinction explains why many people gravitate toward potentially dangerous individuals who nevertheless appear spiritually elevated. How to recognize psychological inflation in someone. Observe their reaction to criticism or disagreement. The archetypally inflated person doesn't process questioning as valuable information but as cosmic order offense. They interpret opposition not as legitimate human disagreement but as resistance to good, truth, or divinity they represent. Jung warned this state endangers not only others but primarily the experiencer. Small ego identification with transpersonal content subjects the psyche to unbearable tension, eventually demanding compensation. Greater inflation leads to more dramatic collapse when denied aspects finally surface. What could prove more disturbing than someone displaying exactly what you expect under all circumstances? Jung discovered an unsettling pattern in certain people. Social adaptation so flawless it eliminates roughness, contradiction, or human spontaneity. This impeccable mask or persona, a term Jung borrowed from Greek theater, represents a warning our instincts detect before conscious articulation. Complete persona identification constitutes extraordinary psychological danger because it indicates total dissociation between external image and inner being. The individual has sacrificed authenticity for social acceptance, creating such elaborate facades that they've forgotten what exists behind them. As poet Fernando Pessoa expressed, danger lies not in masks but in forgetting they are masks. Eastern contemplative traditions have identified this phenomenon for millennia. Zen Buddhism discusses the original face before birth, essential authenticity existing beyond social constructions. Taoist masters warned about polishing surfaces so extensively that substance erodes. Jung simply translated these ancient observations into modern psychological language. The warning emerges when perceiving strange artificiality in someone's interactions. Though their behavior remains technically perfect, this person always knows appropriate words, actions, and expressions, yet everything lacks unpredictability and inconsistencies inherent in authentic humanity. As Jungian analyst James Hollis noted, excessive social adaptation perfection often indicates proportional inner emptiness. Contemporary neuroscience has identified fascinating phenomena related to this dynamic. Our brains possess mirror neurons detecting subtle incongruities between others' verbal, facial, and bodily expressions. When someone's social mask completely divorces from inner reality, these neurons generate warning signals we experience as inexplicable unease or distrust. Real danger lies in what extreme dissociation conceals. When someone invests all psychological energy maintaining perfect external images, rejected personality aspects don't simply disappear. They accumulate unconsciously, forming what Jung called shadow. The more rigid the persona, the more chaotic and potentially destructive their shadow becomes when inevitably emerging. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's close collaborator, observed that those presenting perfect social adaptation often experience shadow eruption episodes, moments where repressed energy explodes unpredictably and potentially destructively. This dynamic explains why apparently perfect people frequently prove capable of surprisingly destructive acts. Complete social persona identification represents, in Jung's words, self-betrayal, abandoning authentic individuality for artificial construction. Like all profound betrayals, it eventually exacts psychological tolls. Imagine conversing with someone when suddenly perceiving subtle yet profound change. The same person physically, but something fundamental has shifted in their gaze, energy, presence quality, as if something ancient and transpersonal were manifesting through them. This unsettling experience, recognized by many traditional cultures as possession, was conceptualized by Jung as archetypal possession, perhaps the most alarming sign detectable in another human being. Archetypes, according to Jung, are primordial human collective psyche patterns, structuring forces containing both luminous and shadowy aspects. When archetypes possess someone's consciousness, they lose individuality and become channels for transpersonal energies exceeding their integration capacity. Various cultures' shamanic traditions perfectly understood this phenomenon. Anthropologist Mircea Eliade documented how shamans differentiated between controlled channeling states and dangerous possession states where individual identity was completely subsumed. Christian mysticism spoke of spirit discernment as essential ability to distinguish beneficial from potentially destructive psychic influences. The warning appears when perceiving someone has lost normal psychological flexibility, becoming rigidly identified with single archetypal patterns. It might be the unquestionable savior, relentless warrior, perpetual victim, or infallible judge. The specific archetype matters less than complete identification with it. Revealing indicators include strange eye luminosity, monolithic speech quality, and peculiar feeling that the person is no longer completely present in ordinary senses. As Jungian analyst Robert Moore pointed out, you're not relating to complete human personality but to archetypal fragment that has seized consciousness control. Modern neuropsychology has identified altered consciousness states where certain brain areas associated with personal identity show reduced activity while areas linked to transpersonal experiences are intensely activated. These states, valuable in controlled ritual contexts, can prove extremely dangerous when occurring spontaneously without appropriate containers. Particularly alarming is that archetype-possessed individuals experience extraordinary certainty and purpose. Ordinary consciousness ambiguity disappears, replaced by absolute conviction that can prove extremely persuasive to others. Jung observed how political and religious leaders in archetypal possession states could catalyze mass movements precisely because of this superhuman certainty quality. Fundamental danger lies in archetypes as collective unconscious primordial patterns containing extreme polarities. The same savior archetype contains both redemptive compassion potential and destructive fanaticism. When someone becomes completely archetypal identified, they inevitably manifest its darkest aspects, often without contradiction awareness. Jung documented numerous cases where archetype-possessed individuals committed acts completely contrary to their conscious values, later experiencing partial amnesia or extreme rationalization. Archetypal possession represents temporary self-reflection capacity loss, precisely what makes us human. There exists a psychological phenomenon so disturbing that recognizing it in someone reveals witnessing genuine tragedy in development. Jung called it repetition compulsion, an unconscious pattern where people obsessively recreate identical painful situations as if trapped in invisible labyrinths from which they cannot escape. This signal, when clearly detected, warns us we're facing extraordinary danger, involvement in psychological drama that doesn't belong to us. What proves truly alarming about repetition compulsion is its automatic, unconscious quality. The person isn't consciously or maliciously choosing to recreate destructive patterns. They're responding to deep psychic forces operating completely outside consciousness. As psychoanalyst Christopher Ballas expressed, they are unthought knowns. Formative experiences so early or traumatic they were never cognitively processed but organize all subsequent experience. Spiritual traditions have recognized this phenomenon for millennia. Buddhism's karma concept originally didn't refer to cosmic reward-punishment systems but precisely to these conditioning patterns leading us to recreate similar circumstances repeatedly. In Judeo-Christian tradition, original sin can be interpreted psychologically as these unconscious patterns we inherit and perpetuate without conscious choice. The revealing sign appears when observing someone consistently ending up in identical painful situations with different people but following amazingly similar scripts. Even more disturbing, the person seems genuinely surprised each time patterns repeat, as if they were destiny's victims instead of unconscious architects of their recurring experiences. Contemporary neuroscience has discovered biological bases for this phenomenon. Early experiences, especially traumatic ones, literally create neural pathways becoming information processing paths of least resistance. Brains develop neurological expectations unconsciously seeking to confirm pre-existing world models, even when these models produce suffering. The most dangerous aspect is that people trapped in unconscious repetition compulsions unconsciously try recruiting others to play roles in their unresolved internal dramas. As psychoanalyst Donald Kalsched pointed out, unprocessed trauma demands to be staged. Without realizing it, we can find ourselves playing roles in stories that began long before meeting these people. Jung observed fascinating phenomena. The more unconscious the repetition compulsion, the more it seems manifesting as synchronicities or significant coincidences in external life. People unconsciously create situations replicating their unresolved internal dynamics but experience these events as if imposed by cruel or unjust external fate. Jungian therapists identify this signal when hearing someone repeatedly narrate stories where they're always betrayed, abandoned, misunderstood, or victimized in surprisingly similar ways. As Marie-Louise von Franz expressed, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Most disturbing is repetition compulsion's almost magnetic quality. People trapped in these patterns unconsciously emit signals attracting precisely those who can help them recreate their original traumatic scenarios. Jung called this phenomenon negative synchronicity, the extraordinary unconscious ability to orchestrate encounters, perpetuating its unresolved patterns. If the signals we've explored reveal deepest dangers according to Jung, there exists a transformative path transcending these threats: conscious shadow integration. This process represents the fundamental difference between psychologically dangerous people and those who have embarked on journeys toward psychic wholeness. The fascinating thing is we can recognize this integration as clearly as we identify its absence. When we perceive it in someone, we're facing psychological danger's antithesis. Shadow integration doesn't mean moral perfection or negative aspects absence. Conversely, it implies humble, conscious recognition of one's own capacity for all errors and darkness we observe in others. As Jung expressed, "I would rather be whole than good," a frequently misunderstood phrase really pointing to differences between authentic psychological integrity and perfection masks hiding dangerous internal divisions. Contemplative traditions have articulated this process for millennia with different languages. Tibetan Buddhism speaks of transforming poison into medicine, recognizing and constructively using even the most difficult emotions and tendencies. Western alchemy, which fascinated Jung tremendously, symbolically represented this process as transmuting lead, rejected aspects, into gold, integrated consciousness. Indicators of people who have genuinely begun this integration process are unmistakable. A peculiar combination of honesty about their shadows and compassion toward others' shadows. These people can admit their problematic impulses and tendencies without excessive shame or self-indulgence, simply as human condition aspects requiring constant awareness. Contemporary neuroscience has confirmed this integration process has observable neurophysiological correlates. Researchers like Daniel Siegel have documented how integrating previously dissociated experience aspects literally creates new neural connections between different brain regions, particularly between primitive emotional centers and prefrontal areas associated with self-reflection. What proves truly transformative about this process is that, paradoxically, consciously recognizing our most difficult aspects dramatically decreases likelihood of unconsciously acting them out. As Jungian analyst Robert Johnson observed, what we deny doesn't disappear. It simply emerges in forms over which we have less control. Conscious integration transforms potentially destructive psychic energy into available creative force. People who have genuinely initiated this inner work exhibit unique quality: ability to see the world in shades of gray instead of absolute black and white. They don't rigidly divide between good and bad, recognizing universal human complexity. As Jungian psychologist James Hollis pointed out, psychological maturity begins when we abandon fantasies of our absolute innocence. Authentic spiritual teachers throughout history have embodied this integration. The Dalai Lama can speak openly about his anger moments. Teresa of Avila recognized her spiritual aridity periods. Sufi mystic Rumi wrote poetically about his internal contradictions. This radical honesty contrasts dramatically with artificial perfection of those dissociated from their shadows. The most reliable integration in process indicator is peculiar combination of genuine humility, not false modesty, and authentic authority, not authoritarianism. Integrated people don't need to proclaim their goodness or wisdom because they've transcended needs for immaculate self-images. As Zen master Shunryu Suzuki expressed, "In beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in expert's mind there are few." Before we conclude, have you recognized any of these signals in important people in your life? Or more importantly, have you detected aspects of these patterns in yourself? If this message resonated with you, write in the comments. Consciousness is transformation's first step. Don't forget to share this content with those who need to awaken to unconscious patterns in their relationships. Activate the notification bell and subscribe for more explorations of the fascinating Jungian universe.